Arthur Daniels took deliberate steps in his strong frame, creating a comforting silhouette while he moved through the streets of at 68, in downtown Tulsa. His steps were purposeful and steady in his stride despite the afteryears had piled up. Behind him, he with a cleanly knotted gray bonnet under his a faded green cloak that gripped the chin, a garment he'd had on his broad shoulders. Since his time in the service, it wasn't. It was cozy and familiar but sophisticated. Similar to an old acquaintance, he had a reusable item in his hand. Shopping bag filled with some food and materials for the after-school program. Arthur volunteered there once a week. Was a man adored and well known by his community. A former soldier, he had devoted 25 years of his life to his nation, facing difficulties that most would fall beneath his greatest achievements. Weren't in the actual battleground. The silent deeds of mentoring service local children, giving guidance to assisting struggling single mothers. Young men discover jobs. He felt that setting an example was important. And his existence in the neighborhood was for many, a steady anchor. Today wasn't clearly. The sun shone brightly, and the streets are alive with the typical cadence of a Arthur nodded Thursday afternoon, courteously setting up at the florist bouquet on the pavement, and traded a couple kind words with the owner of the corner store, and waved to a young child. With much enthusiasm from a passing school bus, these brief conversations were a component of his little confirmations of his involvement in a community that held him in high regard. Jake Patterson, meantime, was parked at the block's end, is slanting slightly. Jake was driving forward in his patrol car at 24. Fresh to the army and ready to establish himself, but prone to errors resulting from untrained and unsupervised biases, observing Arthur's every action. His hand resting via his side mirror firmly on the steering wheel of his. The dashboard exploded with a notification regarding a small-scale theft nearby, and anything regarding Arthur's confident and steady gait. But slowly put Jake on edge. Jake failed to identify Arthur, had not been raised in this area of the city, and didn't comprehend its dynamics. Arthur was merely a man on the street, and the mounting urgency to take action obscured his judgment in his capacity as an officer. Judgment, his fears started to grow more. Was this his opportunity to catch him? Could someone caught red-handed be the instant he demonstrated his value to his Arthur rounded a corner towards superiors? Jake switched on the patrol at his house, lights, and struck the gas, causing the siren to scream. Jake interrupted it for a moment, bringing the car to a stop inside a few feet. The veteran stopped in before Arthur did. Though shocked, his tracks composed a couple. As onlookers slowed, heads turned. Jake was curious to find out what was going on. Emerged from the vehicle with a quick step. It exposed his "Excuse me, sir," Jake said in a nervous voice. "Sharper than I meant. May I say something?" Arthur turned to face you, unfazed. The young officer spoke calmly. "Even so, officer. How may I be of assistance?" Jake, you didn't respond right away. Rather, his gaze flitted to the "Where is the shopping bag" in Arthur's hand. Arthur lifted a brow at you, coming from a little perplexed by the inquiry just been picked up from the community center. "Some groceries are on their way." Jake's jaw is incorrect, tightened. "There have been theft reports. Do you have identification in the area?" You didn't miss the subliminal hint on Arthur, but he held fast to his "naturally." He spoke slowly and calmly. He reached for his wallet and gave it to him, his veteran ID on the card's corners. Jake is a little worn from years of use. Looked over the card, but didn't appear to. Pleased with the contents of the bag, he requested his tone that leaned suspiciously toward groceries. Arthur just answered, "Would you like to watch?" as Arthur revealed what was inside the bag. The items include bread, an egg carton, and a set of markers for Jake's children. Although he refused to acknowledge it, his face flushed. He sensed the tiny group of people that had assembled a little distance from their eyes staring at him. The veteran's composed manner merely served to Jake more defensive, only responding to inquiries according to Officer Arthur. Reducing the tension silence if I don't want anything else. To head Jake's hand automatically went to his house to his baton remains close to his belt. "Arthur, where are you?" "I'm not finished yet." His countenance shifted slightly as he froze. Still serene, but now tinged with unbelief. "I'm not sure why I haven't done anything." Nevertheless, there was a lot of tension in the air, and Jake sensed the fears of the young officer, and pride started to strongly clash in his laying the stage for something that doesn't one anticipated as the whispers from the tiny as the throng became louder. Jake's hold on power started to falter. The subsequent events would be different. The hum of the audience endures forever, grew louder, a mix of bewilderment, and Arthur looked at the spectators with concern. His calm manner, unbroken officer, he stated in a stern voice. However, I don't believe this is necessary. I'm pleased if there's a problem. To accompany you to the station and assist with Jake's pride had taken hold. But it was out, as it was firmly grasping his shoulders tensed, and the twitch of his jaw he was. Suddenly, he sensed the burden of the steps from the tiny group of people assembling in his imagination on the sidewalk. They weren't curiously observing. They were evaluating and interrogating his. Jake's authority would not let that occur. You have no say in what is required. Jake yelled, raising his volume now, moved toward Arthur and held out his hand. I said, stroking the baton at his waist. Remain where you. Arthur remained steadfast, his expression composed. However, despite my resolute refusal to be a relocation officer, I possess the right to understand what this is. Jake's annoyance was boiling over, felt powerless, surrounded by his own unthinking insecurities. He pushed Arthur, felt the crowd's pressure in his chest. Arthur gasped as he staggered back, but regained his equilibrium with his gray bonnet. He adjusted it after it moved a little, calmly continuing to decline to participate in the officer's son. You don't want to act aggressively. Arthur spoke quietly, and his words conveyed the weight of fatherhood-related experience, advising a child not to make a mistake they'd eternal regret. But Jake wasn't paying attention. His hands were shaking at this point, the rush of excitement throughout his body. He moved closer, like an escaped train, currently holding the baton as though he required an anchor. Hey, what are you doing? He said. A young woman had yelled out, from the crowd. Her phone out, taping the whole trade. Others started following suit, bringing up their phones as the stress enters. The atmosphere turned into. Arthur found the cameras to be intolerable. The children's anxious faces are gripping. He held up their parents' hands, palms up slowly. Let's avoid making this even worse, he added, staring Jake in the eye. Yet the purpose of those words was de-escalation. Just made Jake more determined to. Arthur's composure was difficult for him. Reminder of his shortcomings and in reason abandoned him at that time. Completely. In a single careless motion, Jake struck Arthur with his fist, directly in front of the veteran's head, jerked back, causing him to collapse to the pavement. A gruesome clang reverberated as the crowd's head collided with the hard concrete. Shouts of incredulity arose in confusion. Fear and rage were in the air as onlookers hurried over to Arthur's side. The young lady on the phone stepped. Her voice was shaking with rage as she spoke. You merely attacked him. He didn't do anything. Jake's chest froze at everything. He looked down, his knuckles heaving red. At Arthur, who is now comatose, his gray bonnet is a little off-center, and for a brief a glimmer of regret briefly appeared in his eyes. But it vanished as soon as panic took its place. And I needed backup. Jake's voice stumbled into his radio. I reiterate that the cracking suspect is down. The suspect is down. Suspect, yelled another onlooker. For heaven's sake, HEK, a veteran angrily. He's not as suspicious as the approaching sirens. In the distance, patrol cars could be heard echoing. A young woman was crouching next to Arthur. She checked and gently adjusted his bonnet. Her hands trembled for a little moment. She spoke in a voice that was heavy with feeling. But he requires an ambulance. Jake now took a mental step back. Running under the weight of his recent actions was starting to take hold. But he didn't possess sufficient time to process the flashing backup vehicle lights reflected in his astonished eyes as officers started to divulge onto the scene. When the paramedics showed up and the audience became more aware of Jake's actions were recorded, not only on video, but in everyone's hearts who saw it. This was no longer merely a clash. It was the beginning of something considerably larger than the ambulances. The sound of sirens sounded as Arthur Daniels was placed his gray bonnet on a stretcher. Carefully nestled in, was a little bloody. His side, one of the paramedics' little gesture of deference amid the chaos. The mob has grown bigger and more irate. Pressed in closer, incredulous expressions, and the scene was filled with indignation as phones stayed up, documenting everything. Jake Patterson positioned himself apart from his hands shaking as he attempted to respond. inquiries from his superior Sergeant Morales, who was just on the Morales, was an experienced police officer. Having a no-nonsense attitude, his keen eyes darted from Jake to the blood on the angry people and the pavement. The audience tells me exactly what happened. Morales insisted on speaking quietly, but solid. Jake's words tumbled as he stammered. Over one another, he wasn't collaborating. I believed he was grabbing something. I didn't mean to interrupt Morales. You didn't mean to gaze at what Patterson, as I'm from the area standing. It appears that you simply attacked an individual who wasn't on the other side of the street. Resisting. The girl who had captured the incident shared the footage on social media. The caption on the media said, "Veteran assaulted." By walking home, the officer isn't in a matter of minutes. The video was comments flooded in, spreading like wildfire. In anger, incredulity, and demands responsibility at Arthur's hospital family. Members showed up with faces marked with Arthur's oldest son, Michael Daniels. Worry's son went into the emergency department carrying the burden of the world on his Michael's shoulders at 40. Were a successful civil rights lawyer renowned for his unwavering drive and burning fire of fairness. But when he saw his dad, on the hospital bed, unconscious, he felt intense primal pain, noticed and reached for his father's hand. Arthur's knuckles were scratched, and the bruises on his voice was just above a shriek. As he addressed the attending, "What's his nurse?" State. The nurse was hesitant to responding that he's stable at the moment, but the severe concussion was caused by a head injury. Hune must remain under. Michael nodded his jaw in observation. Constricting as he found it difficult to keep his calm, he looked to his younger Vanessa, the sister, who sat calmly in the she was crying in the corner. Michael said, "Face, this doesn't end here." His calm voice was infused with determination. "We'll make certain everyone is aware of what occurred, but nobody gets to carry out this action on our..." The video of a parent who was back on the streets. Local news had reported on the assault. Stations. In a matter of hours, national outlets, plastering. Jake Patterson's skull face across screens with the text, "An officer abused a veteran in the video," immediately ignited Tulsa. Demonstrations outside the police force. Chants of Arthur's justice filled the air while high demanding signs waved accountability. The community came together. Many were united in their outrage, and Arthur was a symbol, rather than merely a victim, of honor, fortitude, and what had being done to him felt quite intimate. Jake is currently limited to his precincts. Sat in his chamber, holding his head in his hands. He was given a wide berth by fellow officers. Unable to read their expressions, the murmurs behind his back became more intense. As the hours went by, he could sense the significance of their assessment. Of his phone buzzed non-stop with no messages, which he was brave enough to open, but just one. His father's text message caught our attention. It said, "A retired police officer himself. Stupid. Before it happens, you must own up to this, son." Obtains. For the first time, the seriousness of Jake was struck like a tidal wave by his deeds. However, it was too late to reverse the world has already witnessed his actions. And the harm was irrevocable. As night descended over the city throbbed with anxiety in the medical facility. Michael started establishing the foundation for the battle that lies ahead, beyond the demonstrations swollen, while carrying the beginnings of a movement that would call for justice. Michael, at the very least. Daniels took a seat next to his father's bed. The continuous buzz of the medical monitors a reminder of how delicate the circumstance. He kept playing back the every frame of the assault's video. Arthur felt a greater rage within himself. Has consistently been the most resilient individual in the life of a man who had experienced war and adversity. With unwavering decide to see him in this condition, bruised and exposed, was unbearable. Michael inhaled deeply. He launched his laptop and started creating a declaration. He was aware that his words had power. That Michael, a civil rights lawyer, had fought cases similar to these for years. This one, but it was personal this time. In addition to being a victim, his father was an emblem of what innumerable others possessed. Endured. Michael's remark in a few hours struck social media. It was straightforward, and my father, Arthur Daniels, was unrelenting. A cherished member and former Army veteran of this neighborhood was brutally attacked by a policeman. While this is about more than just him walking home, it concerns a framework that permits this to occur repeatedly. And we demand justice, not only for my dad, but also for each victim of unbridled authority and prejudice. The battle begins. In a matter of minutes, the post became viral. Celebrities, activists, and even veterans' organizations disseminated it, enhancing the hashtags for stories, such as "Justice for Veteran" and "Arthur are not expecting" moved across platforms. The buzzing of Michael's phone, continuously sending out offers of support for media and legal support questions as demonstrations outside the police. Michael stood in front of the growing department. Of a group of reporters, with his Vanessa, a sister, and a community leaders. The news conference was a sensation of electricity charged the air. "Of my father served this country with urgency." Michael started his voice with dignity. Steadfast yet passionate, he lifted his kids to believe in justice, equity, and fairness, and responsibility. Yet he was nonetheless treated like a criminal for just going home on foot. This goes beyond a single lousy cop. This concerns a culture that permits this sort of conduct to continue. But to be clear, we won't pause till justice is served for my father, as well as everyone who has been harmed by this damage system. The audience cheered loudly, and cheers to Arthur's chance at justice, returning with much more vigor. Meanwhile, within the police department, an internal inquiry was started. Jake Patterson was put on administrative leave, but the community wanted to be charged and demanded more. Desired responsibility, and Michael Daniels wasn't going to disappoint them. As Michael examined Jake's record in greater detail, he discovered concerning trends and grievances from other citizens, examples of severe force that was ignored by every one of it depicted a youthful Michael's badge as unsuitable for the officer. The team assembled and presented the evidence to the district and the general public lawyer. But the actual revelation arrived when Michael got a tip from an unidentified source regarding Jake's history. A confidential report from the police academy's description of a confrontation in which Jake had utilized unwarranted force during a training session workout. The report was suppressed, but it was now on the verge of being visible. At a town hall gathering in the community, Michael disclosed the results, which aren't simply regarding a violent incident, he said, displaying a copy of the report, regarding a pattern, one that they ignored the system until it was too late, and my dad is currently resting in a hospital bed. Due to their carelessness in the ed room, a combination of fury and resolve occupying the movement was expanding in space, and with the strain on the division, and Jake was now detained by the city authorities. Up in his tiny apartment, observing the coverage with a depressing sense of desire to establish himself as a demonstrate his abilities. But his name was a metaphor for anything that was flawed in the remarks of his father to law enforcement, reverberated in his head. "You must acknowledge, son," but taking responsibility entailed much more than just saying "I'm sorry," which entailed confronting the repercussions as the movement gained momentum, and the supporting data increased. The query: would justice ultimately triumph? Will this be just one more chapter in a lengthy history of weeks of unmet promises past? But Arthur's fire started. Assault was more intense than before. Demonstrators kept pouring into their slogans, reverberating through the street city. As requests are made for Jake following Patterson's arrest, thousands of signatures. The incident's video had turned into a flash show for a more comprehensive discussion regarding enforcing responsibility and racial bias in America. Arthur was still in a coma. Every day, Michael sat by, gets visited by his family. Every night by his bedside, conversing with him, gently informing him on the progress of his tale had. One night, Dad Michael muttered, "I am inspired." The cracking of his voice has always been, "This time, we are fighting. The fighter awaiting the district is putting increasing pressure on you." The lawyer filed official charges, aggravated against Jake Patterson, assault and misbehavior in the workplace. The announcement provided a sense of comfort to the Daniels family and others that stand behind them. However, Michael was aware that this was only the taking responsibility was the first step. Jake's true objective was systemic change, appeared in court with his former bride now substituted with a quiet. With remorse, he averted his eyes. Of the charges against Arthur's family were, for many, reading aloud his sentence would never felt sufficient. But it was an uncommon a system's moment of accountability. It frequently didn't perform a miracle in the hospital. Occurred over a month later, Arthur. When he opened his eyes, the room was crowded with cries and gasps as Vanessa demanded. The Arthur, the nurse, had a steady but feeble gaze. When he turned to face Michael, Michael knelt next to him and whispered, "You've been pouring down his face. Endured a lot, Dad. But you're now safe. And we're working to ensure that this doesn't occur." Once more, Arthur took a while to recuperate, but steadied the day he was at last capable of get out of the hospital and into the community. Gathered outside with placards to welcome him. Reading Arthur and our hero's welcome return filled the air with applause. Arthur, leaning on a cane, looked up. Looking gratefully out at the audience, he moved forward and spoke quietly. "But I have powerfully experienced war, through adversity, and through unfairness. But what transpired with me is a reminding everyone that nobody is exempt from the we are all responsible for our system's shortcomings. Not only for ourselves, but to demand better. However, we cannot allow future generations to this is just another tale that we must convert it into a turning point." The audience erupted in applause. Their solidarity is evidence of the strength of standing. The battle between the Daniels family had initiated a movement that spread far, reaching areas outside of Tulsa. As for Jake Patterson, his country resignation from the military was unavoidable, but his court cases were only getting started. His name would be a warning story for years to come. Reminder of the negative effects of unbridled authority and discrimination over the next few months. Tulsa witnessed actual alter the police force enacted changes, such as required training in de-escalation and community supervision committees. It wasn't flawless, and while it wasn't sufficient, it was a beginning. Michael is considering how the journey ended out. One day, while they were sitting on the porch of Arthur's small house, "I used to believe that change was while it's impossible, you showed me that one. A person's tale might motivate." Arthur grinned as he moved his gray bonnet. Securely balanced on his head, "Son, the battle never ends as long as we never give up. There is always hope." That concludes the narrative of the Daniels family. Became evidence of tenacity, responsibility, and the strength of community to make a demand. Arthur's journey serves as a reminder of justice. When injustice is present, all quiet is speak up, behave complicitly, and collectively. We can make the world a better place. If this story touched you, remember to like. For more stories, subscribe and share. That motivate transformation.